The night was cold, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the quiet village. In a small, dimly lit room, a man named Thomas lay on his bed, his eyes wide open. His heart raced, not from fear, but from a deep, gnawing feeling that twisted his insides. Thomas was envious. He was envious of his neighbor, a man who had just bought a new coat, a coat that Thomas could never afford. The more he thought about it, the more the envy consumed him, turning his thoughts dark and bitter. Envy is a strange and powerful emotion. It can make the kindest person feel like a monster. Thomas had always been a good man, but now as he lay there, he felt a dark cloud settling over his heart. He couldn't shake the feeling that his neighbor's good fortune was his own misfortune. In the Middle Ages, envy was not just a feeling, it was a sin. Some called it a passion, a natural but dangerous emotion that could lead a person astray. Others, like the 15th century Bishop Reginald Peacock, saw it as a more complex issue. Peacock believed that envy, like all passions, was a suffering of the will rather than an active choice. Passions, he argued, were not inherently good or bad. They were just feelings that could be controlled. But what was the difference between envy as a passion and envy as a sin? Peacock explained that envy as a passion was rooted in the lower sense appetite, the part of us that reacts to what we see, hear, touch, smell, or taste. It was a natural response, like feeling sad when you see someone else with something you want. However, envy as a sin was a free choice, a decision to act on those feelings in a harmful way. For Thomas, the distinction was clear. He felt the passion of envy, but he didn't act on it. Yet the feeling lingered, gnawing at him like a hungry beast. He knew that if he didn't control it, it could turn into a sin, a habit that would be hard to break. Aquinas, a famous medieval philosopher, saw envy as a form of sorrow. He believed that sorrow, when directed by reason, could be useful. It could help us avoid evil and feel remorse after sin. But when reason was overpowered, sorrow became harmful, consuming the soul and destroying the body. Envy, in particular, was always sinful. It was sorrow for another's good, a feeling that made us grieve over what should make us rejoice. Thomas's neighbor, the man with the new coat, was not just a symbol of good fortune. He was a reminder of Thomas's own struggles. The more Thomas focused on his neighbor's success, the more his heart ached. He tried to reason with himself, to remind himself that his neighbor's good fortune didn't take away from his own life, but the envy was too strong. In medieval times, people believed that envy was linked to the humors, the 4 bodily fluids that controlled a person's health and temperament. Envy was often associated with the melancholic humor, which was cold and dry. This humor could cause physical symptoms like digestive distress and a shriveled appearance. Thomas felt these symptoms acutely. His stomach churned, and his body felt weak and thin. One day, Thomas heard a sermon by a local monk named Robert Ripon. Ripon talked about the relationship between envy and anger. He said that both envy and anger were connected to the choleric humor, which was hot and dry. This humor could make a person easily angered and envious. Ripon described envy as a hidden hatred that burned inside a person, causing their heart to inflame with excessive heat. Thomas found this explanation both fascinating and terrifying. It was as if the monk was describing his own condition. He realized that his envy was not just a feeling, it was a physical and emotional state that was slowly consuming him. In a famous medieval poem called Piers Plowman, the poet William Langland described a character named Envy in great detail. Envy was depicted as a man with sunken cheeks, a shriveled body, and chewed lips. He suffered from severe indigestion and heart problems. Langland's envy was a physical embodiment of the sin, a person who was so consumed by envy that it was visible on his body. Thomas couldn't help but see himself in this description. He was pale and thin, his body racked by the same physical symptoms. He wondered if there was any cure for his condition. The monk Ripon had suggested that the moisture of piety could counteract the dryness of envy. But Thomas found it hard to feel pious when his heart was so heavy with envy. One night, Thomas decided to seek help. He confided in a local priest, who listened to his struggles and offered some advice. The priest reminded him that envy was a sin, but it was not a sin without a cure. The first step was to acknowledge the feeling, and then to seek forgiveness through confession. The priest also suggested that Thomas try to focus on his own blessings and remember that everyone has their own struggles. Thomas took the priest's advice to heart. He began to practice gratitude and tried to see the good in his own life. It wasn't easy, but slowly, the dark cloud of envy began to lift. He realized that his neighbor's new coat didn't diminish his own worth. In fact, it inspired him to work harder and strive for his own goals. Envy, Thomas learned, was a powerful emotion, but it didn't have to control his life. With the right mindset and a little help, he could overcome it. But the journey was far from over, and the dark embrace of envy would always be lurking, waiting for the next moment of weakness. In the world of medieval literature and thought, wrath or anger is a powerful and complex emotion that stands at the crossroads of the spiritual and the physical. Unlike the more spiritual sins like pride and envy, wrath has a tangible, bodily impact that can be both destructive and, in some cases, constructive. Medieval thinkers placed wrath somewhere in the middle of the 7 deadly sins, bridging the gap between the sins of the spirit and those of the flesh. Thomas of Chobham, a prominent confessional writer, described wrath as being near the flesh, highlighting its physical manifestations. In the framework developed by Alexander of Hales, wrath, along with avarice and sloth, affects the anima, or the irascible part of the soul, which deals with our responses to challenges and threats. One of the most common ways to understand wrath is through its destructive power. In medieval literature, wrath is often depicted as a force that consumes the self. For example, in the early 5th century poem Psychomatia by Prudentius, wrath attacks patience and, in a fit of rage, ultimately destroys itself. This theme of self-destruction is echoed in later works. John Gower, in his Confessio Amantis, describes a lover who harms himself in moments of anger, biting his lip and whipping himself, unable to find peace or rest. The destructive nature of wrath is also seen in its physical effects. Many texts describe the wrathful as suffering from fever, swelling, and even madness. The Book of Vices and Virtues explains that when a person is consumed by wrath, they may lose their appetite, sleep, and eventually fall ill or even die. This fever is not just a physical ailment, but a symbolic one, representing the inner turmoil and destruction caused by unbridled anger. Wrath is often associated with madness, a state where reason is clouded and the mind is overwhelmed. The Fasciculus Morum states that wrath blocks the mind from seeing the truth, just as turbulent air obscures the sun. In John Lydgate's Pilgrimage of the Life of Man, wrath boasts of blinding people and making them act like beasts. This loss of reason is a recurring theme, highlighting how anger can distort one's judgment and lead to irrational behavior. While wrath is generally seen as destructive, medieval thinkers recognized that it could also have positive aspects. Thomas Aquinas, a leading theologian, noted that anger itself is not inherently sinful. When directed by reason and used to achieve justice, anger can be virtuous. For example, being angry about an injustice and taking action to correct it is morally justifiable. However, when anger overpowers reason, it can lead to sinful actions. Medieval medical texts also provide insights into the physical effects of wrath. According to Lanfranc of Milan, a surgeon, anger can cause the vital spirits to rush to the wounds, leading to swelling and complications. He advises surgeons to calm their patients to prevent this. Similarly, the English bishop Reginald Pococke wrote extensively on the relationship between the body and the passions. He believed that a person's humoral balance, or the mixture of bodily fluids, could influence their susceptibility to anger. For instance, a choleric person who is prone to quick temper might find it harder to control their anger. Pococke also argued that while anger can be harmful, it can sometimes be beneficial. For the phlegmatic, who are naturally calm and slow, a bit of anger can help them think more clearly and act more decisively. This ambivalence in the effects of wrath reflects the complex nature of the emotion and its role in both physical and spiritual well-being. In medieval literature, wrath is often described through metaphors and metonyms that highlight its physical and emotional intensity. For example, The homilist in a sermon on Jesus healing a man with palsy draws a metaphorical connection between the man's physical condition and the spiritual effects of wrath. He explains that just as bad blood can cause palsy, wicked thoughts and anger can lead to spiritual paralysis. This metaphor underscores the idea that wrath can make a person waste away, both physically and spiritually. Ultimately, the key to managing wrath lies in the balance of reason and passion. Aquinas emphasized that reason should guide the expression of anger, ensuring that it serves a just purpose rather than leading to sin. Pecock, too, stressed the importance of self-control, especially for those with a predisposition to anger. By understanding the physical and emotional aspects of wrath, medieval thinkers and writers aimed to help individuals navigate the complex interplay between the body and the soul, ultimately striving for a more balanced and virtuous life. In the dynamic and often chaotic world of medieval thought, wrath is a sin that requires careful consideration and control. Whether seen as a destructive force or a potential for justice, wrath's impact on both the body and the soul is a testament to its enduring significance in understanding human nature. In the world of medieval medicine and writing, anger was seen in a very different light than we might think of it today. It wasn't just a feeling. It was something that could physically affect your body and even help in some situations. Let's dive into how this worked. Imagine a doctor from long ago. He might tell a patient, first, anoint him with poppy if he has anger in his liver. This might sound strange, but in those times, anger was thought to be a physical condition, something you could see and feel in the body. For example, a doctor named Lanfranc said that anger could cause blood to gather in a wound, making it harder to heal. He also advised patients to avoid anger when they were sick, just like you might tell someone to avoid running if they have a sprained ankle. But anger wasn't always seen as bad. Some writers thought it could be useful. For example, in a book about health, it was said that a little anger could help a person who was too shy or timid. It could give them the courage to make decisions and take action. This idea is a bit like how a little bit of stress can sometimes help you focus and get things done. Anger was also seen as a mix of good and bad. There was good anger that could be directed against evil, and bad anger that could lead to harmful actions. A famous thinker named Aquinas believed that anger could be a just and virtuous emotion if it was used to fight against wrongdoing. This idea was echoed in many religious texts, which taught that being angry about evil was not a sin. In medieval times, people believed that your body and soul were closely connected. For example, a text called Jacob's Well described how anger could make a person act like someone possessed by a demon. The angry person might hurt themselves, foam at the mouth, and grind their teeth. This was a way of showing how anger could make someone lose control, both physically and spiritually. When it came to identifying angry people, doctors and writers had some clues. They thought angry people, or choleric people, often had red skin, stared intensely, and acted as if they were a bit mad. This was because anger was associated with an excess of a hot, dry humor called choler. Since hot and dry were considered male qualities, anger was more often seen as a male problem in medieval texts. This even affected how the law treated men and women. Men could sometimes use hot anger as a defense for their actions, while women rarely had this option. Anger also had different effects on men and women. For example, women who got angry might have problems with their menstrual cycles, and anger could even cause miscarriages. This shows how deeply people believed that emotions could affect the body. To treat anger, medieval doctors and writers recommended a variety of remedies. One common suggestion was to practice meekness or patience. Chaucer's parson, for example, said that being meek could calm the stirrings of the heart that lead to anger. Another remedy was science, which meant having clear and measured thinking. When this clear thinking entered a person's heart, it could push out the roots of anger and evil. Another way to combat anger was through fear, especially the fear of God. When someone was afraid, their heart would grow cold, which could counteract the heat of anger. This was seen as both a spiritual and a physical remedy. One of the most common antidotes to anger was patience. In a poem called Patience, the virtue of patience was described as a way to steer the heart through difficult times. This was important because anger could make a person lose control, both in their actions and in their health. Nicholas Love, in his Mirror of the Blessed Life of Jesus Christ, said that Christ's patience was a medicine that could heal even the worst anger. In the famous poem Piers Plowman, the character of wrath is one of the least physically described vices. Unlike envy, who is shown as being swollen with anger, wrath mostly talks about how he causes others to be angry. He describes himself as a gardener who plants lies to create conflicts, and a cook who serves up gossip to stir up trouble. However, when he drinks too much wine, he can't control himself and ends up with a flux of a foul mouth for days. This shows how anger and the choleric humor could affect the body, leading to physical symptoms like diarrhea and vomiting. In medieval times, the idea that anger was both a physical and a spiritual condition was very common. People believed that managing your emotions was crucial for both your health and your soul. Whether it was through meekness, patience, or fear, the goal was to keep the body and soul in balance, avoiding the extremes of anger that could cause harm. In the world of the Middle Ages, avarice or greed was a sin that puzzled even the greatest thinkers. St. John Chrysostom, a church father from the early 400s, was one of the first to ask why avarice was so different from other sins. He noticed that sins like lust and anger could be explained by the way the body worked, but avarice seemed to come from somewhere else. Later, St. Thomas Aquinas, a famous theologian, categorized avarice as a sin of the spirit, even though it involved things that were very much part of the physical world, like money and possessions. Aquinas explained that while sins like lust affect the body directly, avarice affects the soul, making people crave wealth and status. Avarice was often placed in a tricky spot in the list of sins. Sometimes it was seen as a sin that bridged the gap between sins of the spirit, like pride, and sins of the flesh, like gluttony. This was because avarice, while a sin of the spirit, still involved very tangible things like money and property. Some medieval writers, like Richard Lavenham, even ranked avarice as the second worst sin, highlighting its serious nature. When it came to describing avarice, medieval writers used a lot of different terms, but the most common ones were avarice, covetousness, and greed. While these words were often used interchangeably, some writers tried to make distinctions. For example, in The Parson's Tale from the Canterbury Tales, Chaucer explained that avarice is about holding on to what you have, while covetousness is about wanting what you don't have. However, these distinctions weren't always clear, and many writers used the terms in a more general way to describe the same greedy behavior. One of the most common metaphors for avarice was the disease called dropsy. Dropsy was a condition that made people feel extremely thirsty, but the more they drank, the thirstier they became. This was a perfect image for avarice, as the more money and possessions a person had, the more they wanted. This idea was used in many sermons and stories to teach people about the dangers of greed. For example, in John Gower's Confessio Amantis, the story of King Midas was used to show how avarice could turn even the most basic things, like food and water, into something harmful. Midas wished that everything he touched would turn to gold, but this wish soon became a curse when he couldn't eat or drink because everything turned to gold. Another common metaphor for avarice was the idea of being trapped in a never-ending cycle of thirst or fever. Just like someone with dropsy could never quench their thirst, the avaricious person could never be satisfied with what they had. This idea was also used to describe how avarice could make people sick in their hearts, unable to enjoy anything because they were always thinking about what they didn't have. Some writers even compared avarice to an open sore that could never heal, no matter how much medicine was applied. The only cure, they said, was to give to others and practice charity, which would help the avaricious person find true satisfaction and peace. Blindness was another metaphor, often used to describe avarice. Peter of Limoges, a medieval writer, explained that when people are greedy, they put their love for money over everything else, including their ability to see what's truly important. He compared this to an eclipse, where the sun is blocked by something that casts a shadow, making it hard to see clearly. This idea was also shown in art and stories, where the avaricious person was often depicted with their eyes fixed on the ground, looking only at their possessions instead of the world around them. Leprosy, a disease that was both feared and stigmatized in the Middle Ages, was also used as a metaphor for avarice. The story of Gizi in the Bible was often cited to show how greed could lead to punishment. Gehazi, the servant of the prophet Elisha, tried to profit from Elisha's healing of a leper named Naaman. As a result, Gehazi was afflicted with leprosy himself. This story was used to warn people that greed could have serious consequences, not just for the greedy person, but for their family and descendants as well. Medieval sermons often used this story to teach that the sins of the parents could be passed down to their children, just like leprosy. In medieval religious texts, avarice wasn't always seen as a distinct passion, but rather as a combination of two other passions, a particular type of desire and fear. Thomas Aquinas explained that while animals naturally desire things like food and water, humans could also desire things beyond what they needed, like wealth and power. This kind of desire, called cupiditas, was seen as a form of avarice. Fear was also a significant part of avarice, as people who were greedy often lived in constant fear of losing what they had. This fear could affect their health, making them feel restless and unable to sleep, as seen in Gower's description of Tantalus, who was always worried about his wealth. Medieval medical writers understood that fear could have a physical effect on the body, causing the vital spirits to rush to the heart and making people feel cold and timid. They believed that fear and coldness could feed off each other, making the fear worse. On the other hand, anger or wrath was seen as a way to counteract fear, as it could draw the vital spirits away from the heart and make people feel warmer and more confident. This idea was sometimes used in medical advice to help people deal with fear and avarice. In the material world, avarice was often associated with the accumulation of wealth and property. Medieval society was deeply concerned with the distribution of wealth, and the church taught that greed was a major obstacle to living a moral and ethical life. Sermons and moral writings often warned against the dangers of hoarding wealth and the importance of giving to the poor and needy. This was seen as a way to break the cycle of avarice and find true happiness and fulfillment. Medieval writers and preachers used these metaphors and stories to help people understand the complex nature of avarice and the importance of living a balanced and generous life. By connecting avarice to diseases, fear, and blindness, they hoped to show how greed could damage both the soul and the body, and how practicing charity and contentment could lead to a healthier and more fulfilling life. As we've explored the intricate connections between the human body and the sin of avarice, it's clear that medieval thinkers saw the aging process as a significant factor in the development of greed. The aging body, with its declining heat and increasing dryness, was thought to make older people more prone to avarice. Medieval theologians and medical writers believed that the body's natural changes could influence a person's moral and ethical dispositions. Thomas of Cantimper and Peter of Limoges both noted that as the body cools with age, the desire for material things grows. This idea is rooted in the belief that the aging body becomes more melancholic, a state characterized by coldness and dryness. This melancholic imbalance was thought to make older people more inclined to hoard possessions and wealth, even though they might need them less. Aquinas addressed the question of whether avarice in old age is a sin. He argued that while the body's natural inclinations can make older people more greedy, they are still responsible for their actions. He believed that natural inclinations should be guided by reason, and if an older person hoards wealth beyond what is reasonable, they are still guilty of sin. Medieval medical texts also linked avarice to the body's humors. The elderly were thought to suffer from a cold and dry complexion, which could lead to avarice. This dryness and coldness were seen as the opposite of the warm, moist qualities needed for generosity and empathy. The elderly's fear of losing what they have and the decline in their physical health could make them more focused on preserving their possessions. Some writers, like Robert Ripon, suggested that the natural dryness of old age could be counteracted by the moistness of pity. By showing compassion and giving alms, the elderly could counteract their natural inclination towards avarice. This idea aligns with the belief that the body and soul are interconnected, and that physical changes can influence moral behavior. However, not all medieval thinkers agreed that avarice is solely a result of the body's aging. Some, like Robert Manning, distinguished between avarice and covetousness. Avarice, they argued, is the hoarding of wealth, which is more common in the elderly, while covetousness is the desire for more, which is more common in the young. This distinction reflects a deeper understanding of the different forms that greed can take. The image of avarice as a cold and dry sin is further emphasized in pastoral texts, which often prescribe almsgiving and pity as remedies. These acts of charity were seen as ways to restore the body's balance and counteract the natural tendency towards greed. The idea is that by helping others, the avaricious person can find a sense of purpose and fulfillment that goes beyond material possessions. In the end, the medieval understanding of avarice and aging offers a complex and nuanced view of human nature. It recognizes that the body's changes can influence moral behavior, but it also emphasizes the importance of personal responsibility and the power of the will to overcome these natural inclinations. Whether through the practice of charity, the cultivation of empathy, or the guidance of reason, the medieval thinkers believed that it was possible to resist the pull of avarice, even in old age.